cellular level. And it is therefore a following or chasing function to the actual start of muscle activity. So here's an oxygen consumption curve. Here's one net, so that would be resting. Here's the start of exercise. And if this exercise requires 10 nets of sustained oxygen consumption, the actual oxygen consumption kind of chases up in a logarithmic way, exponential way, until it stabilizes somewhere like 5-10 minutes into the work. So what do we call this gap here between what would be needed in terms of oxygen consumption, the energy demand of the work, versus what the actual oxygen, what do we call that? That's your oxygen deficit. And so if that's the deficit, also when you stop exercise, that down to 1 med, it doesn't just plummet, there's this taper. And what did we call that tapering? Funny little name, EPOC. Excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, and that's where I'm going to start to talk a little bit. Oh, between the two, at very light work, these two will tend to be very close to equal. Which one is generally bigger than the other between the two? The EPOC is greater than the oxygen deficit. The oxygen deficit is the coverage by anaerobic metabolism while your mitochondria speed up. At the end, the EPOC includes some other things, because other things may have gotten deranged during the exercise. And so the EPOC includes that volume, but then there's some additional volumes to it. I'm going to show you in a moment. In fact, a lot of people who study the EPOC, when you do, you can do that modeling where you try to put kinetics on it and figure out what different, you actually have usually 2 kinetics, a fast and a slow. And I will show you what does that. But the fast component tends to have to do with this, that things that happen on the onset of exercise, like, well, let me show you. Let's do this. Why isn't that showing? Come on. Showy to the people. Oh, that's annoying. Good morning, Katie. Feeling better?
Yeah.
Good. Glad to hear it. Let's see if this works. Oh, it came disconnected. That's definitely an impediment. So, the stuff in the fast component of recovery, or related to the oxygen deficit, is stuff that happens with every work bout and has to rapidly be corrected. Just in case the person works again, you think you've gotten away from the tiger, but it's actually behind the rock you're hiding in. So the immediate things that happen, boom, the instant you stop exercise. I showed you that MRI of creatine phosphate that's depleted as the work happens, and then as soon as the work stops, the way it came back up within a few seconds. So immediately resynthesizing your cytosolic levels of ATP and creatine is really important. You will have, usually you've not drained the oxygen off hemoglobin in the blood, but the intracellular stores of oxygen on the myoglobin protein inside muscle cells, that will drain down and it will come right back up. So that's one of the few non-mitochondrial places that oxygen goes. When you finish the exercise, you may not have all your calcium put away. The circuit pump has stuff to do. If you've been doing intense work, there's too much sodium inside the cell and too much potassium outside. And so these are going to be residual subsarcolemmal mitochondrial activity to try to get things back to where you started. Is that making sense? So certainly these 3 are ones that we know have to do with the rapid recovery. Then there's other things that are going to linger. For instance, I think you guys know about what's sometimes called the Q10 effect. If you simply heat up a cell bath, the cells run faster. They consume more oxygen, right? Because you're optimizing their enzymatic optima for temperature and all. Am I making sense? So until you cook them. So if our body temperatures at the end of a workout like that are 101, well, you're going to have a slightly elevated metabolism until such time as your body temperature returns to normal. Does that make sense? Another longer term one is some of the let's see, resynthesis of this one will take, so let's say it was a nice workout like last night I did 45 minutes on the bichromatometer hard, about 160 watt average, and used almost 600 calories in that 45 minutes. So by the time I finish, I haven't depleted my glycogen all the way, but I've probably eaten 50% of the glycogen granule. Well, guess what happens when I then go home and have a little fruit salad before bed? All night long, I am resynthesizing my glycogen, that costs oxygen, and that's part of the long-term recovery period. There's other things you could do. Is Eric here today? Has Eric wandered in yet? If you're a bodybuilder, Katie will do. If you're a bodybuilder, remember you do the workout and it's hard, the time that you're actually making the more sarcomeres, that's afterwards. And so that, any sort of anabolic process that uses oxygen to rebuild the body is part of the slow component to the Does that make sense? Okay. But one thing, the reason we changed to this stupid acronym from the very nice oxygen debt term is because unfortunately A.V. Hill speculated back in 1917, how smart was this guy, that the oxygen debt, the EPOC, was mostly due to resynthesizing lactate into glucose. It's a reasonable presumption, but we don't do that. Glucose is such a cool fuel that rather than spend the energy to resynthesize it, it's easier for us as mobile, smart apes to just go find more glucose in the world. All right. So we're in the midst of sort of talking about these kinetic responses in a single workload to oxygen. So how the oxygen response to the workload. So this is in a single block of work, but it's all the same intensity. Now I'm going to skip anaerobic thresholds for a moment. I'll come back to it. And right now I want to go to VO2 max because it's going to help us sort of, we're trying to build a working theory of, so when do anaerobic processes predominate? When do aerobic processes predominate? How do we determine the mixture? Right? So I'm going to go up to VO2 max. This kind of curve, notice the x-axis here. There's two kinds of exercise curves you're going to see a lot of in this class. This is a single work bout in time. So this is me on the bichromatometer holding a single workload. This is what we call graduated or graded work, where every few minutes you pop more workload on. So this is like running up a hill that gets steeper and steeper and steeper. So this is a progressive exercise test taking you to max. Now notice, here's rest, zero load cycling. This is oxygen consumption. Notice how linear the response to oxygen consumption is to work. You put work on, the mitochondria chase. Unfortunately, in this study, work was added every minute, so it's hard to actually see the plateauing thing that really happens. But then when you get to maximum, VO2 max, this term, you hear a lot of people throw this word around and have no idea what they're saying. The volume of oxygen uptake per minute that is maximal for that particular organism at that time. And here's how you measure that. So in this study, they didn't push their subjects once they hit, but they hit max, they hit this, and then you advance the workload again. You never stop advancing the workload in a VO2 max. The subject ends the test. The experimenter does not. The subjects end the test when they see they can't do it anymore. They fall down and sweep off the back. Not really, but you. So notice, here their oxygen consumption has ceased to go up, and yet you've added something like 30 more watts of work. So here's my question, be brave. How are they doing that work? The pedals are turning. The subject is still working. They don't look very happy, but they're still working. So how are the contractions being resupplied with ATP if the mitochondria are tapped out? Right? It's got to be anaerobic metabolism. Are you seeing that? And so I put up some stuff here about it, but the definition of VO2 max is you add increasing blocks of work until such time as the oxygen consumption no longer goes up. But you must add more work to prove that the oxygen consumption is tapped out. And notice that one of the criteria, there's a bunch of criteria to prove you have to hit a high heart rate, You're rating a perceived exertion. You must experience the work is very hard. The lactate is near maximum. And this is part of the indicator you've truly reached max. You're using a huge amount of anaerobic metabolism to do that last workload. That make sense? Okay. So this is, we're going to move into the topic of, so how do we determine the balance of aerobic and anaerobic in work? And it turns out that these anaerobic mechanisms, cytosolic ATP regeneration, are backup systems. Anytime the mitochondria can't cover the whole load. Everyone here right now is in perfect mitochondrial balance, and so there's almost accidental molecules of lactate being made just because the pathway's open, but there's no drive, right? Your mitochondria are doing the whole deal. So our two examples that I've given here at the end of the lecture is, anytime you start a workload or increment a workload, you know, if you then added another workload here, this would then go up again. And it's anaerobic metabolism that's covering us until the mitochondria catch up. Make sense? And then the last example that I just gave is, if you hit VO2 max and then have to do more, by the way, if you're a soccer player or a basketball player, you hit VO2 max all the time. You probably hit it 5 times during the, especially if you're a guard, 5 times during a game. Right, and so I may be at VO2 max as I juke the defender and come around to see the post. But that last little stop and shot, that could easily be, you know, 130% of my VO2 max. I'm using anaerobic function. That leap for the diving header, anaerobic. Making sense? So here's the hard one. I'm trying to lead us up to lactate threshold without driving us all insane. What if the rate of force production, so you're doing a workload, and then someone turns up the workload. So in order to accomplish that next workload, you need to recruit more fibers. This is usually what happens. When we up a workload, you've got to go get more muscle out of the cell, more motor units out of the muscle. So what will happen when the only motor units that are left are 2x? In terms of how do 2x's like to produce, how do they like to regenerate ATP? Yeah, they have mitochondria. They use their mitochondria rest. But their mitochondrial population is not dense enough to really support high-level work, and so they go anaerobic. They do it in the cytosol. Does that make sense? So let me see if I can, for right now, but we'll talk about this for the rest of the course. It's one of the things that nobody understands very well. Again, I always hear in the club, I hear the personal trainers going, okay, you're doing the work, you do the work, and you get to a point where you really can't consume enough oxygen to do the work anymore. And so you start to make lactate. This is a very if you think that's the description, it's okay. Many people, by the way, that's a perfect description of what happens at VO2 max. It has nothing to do with what happens at anaerobic threshold, because oxygen consumption continues to rise at anaerobic thresholds. So it is not a lack of oxygen that creates. In fact, I keep meaning to do this in the summer. I need to do a VO2 max test once when I'm regular and once on 40% oxygen, and you'll find it doesn't influence the VO2 max at all. I mean, sorry, the anaerobic threshold at all. So, for right now, lactate threshold, anaerobic threshold, ventilatory threshold, OBLA, onset of blood lactate accumulation. A lot of coaches talk about OBLA. And critical lactate clearance point, that's George Brooks's term. These all mean the same thing. They're all, for you right now, they're rough synonyms. When you get into it, they resolve into different things. But they're all trying to capture the same phenomenon, which is that the harder you work, above about 60% VO2 max, the more anaerobic contribution there is, and what's up with that. So George Brooks's, I would star this one, because this is probably the most scientific. What he's saying here, critical lactate clearance point, is that at most levels of exercise, any additional lactate added to the blood is cleared. And so you do not have big changes in blood lactate. Here's a nice light workload. 1/2 is resting. The person starts the workload, there's a barely detectable bump in their blood lactate, and then within 5 minutes their body has pulled it back down. What phenomenon over there on that graph is this due to, this little bump? The oxygen deficit. So you can actually see the anaerobic metabolism that's covering for the mitochondria. Then notice as you go up to higher workloads, you start to get bigger oxygen deficits, right? But the body in general is able to remove almost all the excess lactate. You know, the heart starts going, cool, there's lactate around, this is awesome. Because I'm working harder than I was at rest. So notice at some point, I really wish they'd done 2.5 because that's VO2 max for this person, and this is probably about 65% VO2 max. I wish they had done one in the middle, because what you would see is this would come up, it would sort of try to stabilize, and then it would start to rip off, meaning that the addition of lactate to the blood at that point was outstripping the ability of the heart, the inactive muscle, the liver to remove it, and so you have an inherently unstable situation. Does that make sense? So that's just a start, I promise. We'll come back to that a lot. Now, why do we have an anaerobic threshold? Why is there more cytosolic glycolysis at high workloads? And the answer is absolutely clear. To do the work. You must recruit enough muscle to do the work. So everyone always chases into, they try to get into the mechanisms. No, keep it simple. The reason you have more anaerobic glycolysis happening is because you recruited more muscle. So why is that more muscle? So I gave you a list. This is the one that everyone likes, and I will admit, if you're in the midst of a heart attack, if your heart has stopped, yeah, those people arrive at the ER with high lactates in their blood. But almost always, failure of delivery is not an option. The other one that I always think about when my ass goes numb when I'm riding my bike is if there's local compression, if you're doing something that is locally cramping off one muscle, then you will drain the oxygen out of that area, and there'll be a little bit. It's not a explanation for naturally occurring anaerobic threshold. Accelerated glycolysis, meaning that pyruvate is being made in the cell faster than mitochondrial. Oh, sure, that's biochemically, that's the definition, right? The whole body way to say that is the rate of lactate production overall exceeds the rate of removal from the blood. So both of these are almost like tautological. They're axiomatic. So why? In this class, the way I'm going to present this to you is probably, there are probably not 20 professors in the country who present it this way. Sue Bodine, one of our national experts, is one of them. This is right, and everyone else is confused. So hang on to your head. I'm probably exaggerating a little bit, but this is what's really happening. You recruit fibers that, you need to do more work. Well, if I need to do more work, I need more sarcomeres. Go get me some more sarcomeres. Those are sarcomeres to make force. Sarcomeres. So you go get sarcomeres that make more force, and it happens the only ones that are left are type 2X, and therefore you make that. Is that okay? So here's a picture of a lactate curve against progressive work. Work is going up and up and up. Notice the blood lactate tends to stay very stable up to about 60% of maximum, and then progressively becomes distorted. Right? I have put in, this is why the size principle was so important for explaining stuff. You remember we talked about how the harder you work, you tap into more of the motor total pool, and there's a very specific order, that it tends to be the small fibers first, and most of the small fibers are oxidative. You then hit into the intermediate fibers, and then into the biggest fibers, which tend to be 2X. So imagine for yourself, see up to this point, look who's doing the work. See, there's even this little tiny, that little up, had to do with the fact that you got to about here, and you're starting to bring in somewhat oxidative type 2As, but the first ugly arrivals of we don't know what to do with oxygen people have occurred. And then beyond this line, look at the next workload. You go up to the next workload, and almost everybody that's left to invite to the party is going to make lactate. Does that help? So I fundamentally look at anaerobic threshold as a recruitment phenomenon. It also explains, by the way, because you'll see you can change your anaerobic threshold quite a bit. And what happens is, remember, didn't we say that type 2X's can become type 2As? And guess what the criteria is? Drew, you're asking about high, interval work. If you can work high enough to recruit these puppies and force them to try to figure out what oxygen is in a nice 2-minute interval, well, in the recovery period, they will start installing more mitochondria, and pretty soon your 2X population has shifted towards a 2A. And so indeed your lactate production curve will shift out to here. It's okay? Okay, that's our first start. You don't have to know everything today. I want to remind you that once we make lactate, nothing is ever wasted. The fiber that made the lactate, here's a fast twitch, a 2X, who has made more lactate that can be accepted into its own mitochondria. Well, if there's a slow twitch fiber right next door, it would love to have that lactate. It knows exactly what to do with it because it has so many mitochondria. Also notice that you could do, so that's inside one muscle. You can also have the lactate leave the muscle. Here's a lactate. By far the majority of it goes to tissues like inactive muscle or heart, and it's combusted, biologically oxidized. You can, this is a minor, this is called the Cori pathway, and I'm not sure we've talked about it in detail, but the Cori pathway is to take 2 lactates, that's 6 carbons. The liver does have a reverse gluconeogenetic pathway that it can take 2 lactates and condense them into a new glucose. And this pathway, the Cori pathway, becomes really important after glycogen depletion. So you're 2.5 hours into your marathon. The aid station is 30 minutes away. How do you maintain your blood glucose? That becomes really important. All okay still? Okay. Well, that takes care of lecture. I can tell we'll run out of time today, but it's okay. It's always better to teach well than teach well. Questions up to there? I'll show, as we go along, I'll show you more evidence that VO2 max and anaerobic threshold are not phenomena. VO2 max is the maximum ability to transport oxygen and of the mitochondria to use it. But the anaerobic threshold is not a transporter deficit phenomenon. It has mostly to do with cellular metabolism and the recruitment patterns. We'll get there. So, why is that not showing? One of the reasons why it's a little confusing today, so yesterday we were really laying out the silverware for cutting up metabolism in a whole creature. And we saw that measuring oxygen consumption is huge because it tells us the lump sum total metabolism. And that RER value, Elisa, did you come today? Thank you for my R values. The R value gives you a sense of what the mitochondria is using in terms of fuel. So today we're going to finish here in 4 slides, how to determine the aerobic versus anaerobic balance. And I'll tell you right now, the sum total is the harder the work, the more above 60% max, the more the anaerobic contribution, and then the time point in that work battle, right? First 10 seconds are always funded by anaerobic metabolism and the mitochondria chase. So do that, and then hopefully in 10 minutes, I will begin to talk about maintaining blood glucose in long endurance exercise. As I said, if you go beyond 2 hours, you've probably chewed up your glycogen granules pretty badly, and the muscle, if it's going to do the work, is going to start snooping around for other sources of glucose, mostly the blood glucose that you were using to run your brain. And so very interesting thing happens. Okay, on to this idea of how do we determine the mixture of anaerobic and aerobic. I don't like this slide anymore because it's not showing that all 3 of these. The oxygen system is working before the exercise starts and it continues to work throughout. So this slide actually turns out better. Notice how there's oxidative metabolism at the very beginning. And so all of these systems cooperate. They operate all at the same time, and they cooperate in terms of they fill each other's gaps. And so, again, read this just to be very clear, because there's so much information about somehow human consciousness, Dr. Oz, or our brain is in charge of metabolism, and it's so not true. Metabolism is a cellular phenomenon. So it comes out like this, just to make this really easy. If all you're trying to do is saying, what fraction of the exercise was funded by phosphagens and anaerobic or cytosolic glycolysis, if you talk about maximum events and see how long they are, so Greg, this is where I was talking about you should be a creatine guy, a creatine phosphagen guy, because for Greg's event, do you discus as well as just shot? And do you do the full turn?
Yes.
Cool. So for Greg, his event, if it's 3 seconds to get him across a ring, I'd be surprised. I think it's done rather sooner than that. And so the energy that he's using for his sporting event is almost all being derived from ATP and a little tiny bit of anaerobic glycolysis. All right? Is Dylan here? Get the impression Dylan runs long distances. If, on the other hand, notice the time scale changes from seconds to minutes. If you're, here's a 1 hour run. Can't even figure out what that is. Let's do hour run. Notice you flipped over because the sustainable pace requires that you be using mostly oxygen. So you're actually doing much less total work here. I wish they had a graph of total work and then divide it down into the parts. That would be a better graph. The 50-50 point, for those of you who are interested, is usually somewhere between the first minute and the second minute. So here I've kind of arbitrarily said around 75 seconds, but it's between the first minute and the second minute, depending on who you are. Anyone here ever run the 800 meter?
Yes.
Is anyone wonder why does it hurt so much? Because you maxed out all 3 energy systems as fast as you could. That's the beauty of the 800 meter, is it falls 2 minutes. Ow! 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 You're using every backup system known to the body to try to keep that work going. All right, so summary, the higher the work rate, the more the anaerobic energy sources are going to contribute because they have faster rates of ATP renewal. They support high intensity work. And then in any work task, as the task goes on in duration, the anaerobic sources tend to drop and the mitochondrial sources tend to turn on. This is another study. These studies have been done repeatedly. This is showing you similarly at 90 seconds, you wind up with a mixture of about 55% anaerobic sources and about 45% oxygen. So again, the 50-50 point is somewhere between that first and second minute, and exactly where will depend on your training state, whether you warmed up or not, whether you're drunk, blah, blah. Okay, so now we're into the last topic of today, which is we're going to talk a little bit about we'll talk generally about substrates and recruit, what do we use for the exercise. But in particular, I want to come down to maintaining blood glucose because this is the obligate fuel of the brain short term. You're not going to adapt to ketones in a 45-minute run. And so you must keep blood glucose up or you must fall down. It's one of those two. So the objectives when we do exercise, the first things driving metabolism is the work rate is what the brain is picking out. The metabolism will be, okay, what pathway can regenerate ATP at the rate it's being used up? And that's a cellular decision. The brain doesn't do that. The fiber type, the amount of work you're doing is usually going to demand a certain amount of muscle mass, and who you invited to the contractile party will also determine, just based on their predispositions, what sort of metabolism you use. Does that make sense? We would like to, whenever possible, spare the muscle glycogen when we can, because you'll see that glycogen is our premier high energy, our high output fuel. And so if you're going to walk 20 miles to the water hole, and when you get to the water hole there is a lion, it behooves you to have used fat to do the walking, so that you have some glycogen left in your muscle for the, oh crap, there's a lion sprint. Am I making sense? Okay, so we'll talk about You can read this. This is almost exactly what I just said. Oh, so when this topic will become more obvious when we start talking about adaptation of this system when you use it. But if it is important whenever possible to not use up blood glucose or muscle glycogen, that the adaptation will do things like the mitochondria will become predisposed to use fat rather than carbohydrate. They always need carbohydrate, obligate. Fat burns in the flame of carbohydrate. But they'll use a higher percentage of fat. And that means they use up the muscle glycogen more slowly. At the same time, you may increase the total amount of muscle glycogen. So if you're using it half as much and you've doubled it, you doubled the amount of glycogen, but you use it half as quickly at the same workload, you just quadrupled your time to exhaustion. You tracking me? And so we'll talk more about these things, but their goal clearly is to cause the same amount of the glucose to be used up more slowly. So, yeah, I might get somewhere. I hope I'm not going too fast. We'll come close to the end of this lecture. So, this is at rest, and I've made you, this vat here represents your blood. The blood glucose, you only have about 4 grams, 16 kilocalories, which is not very much. And it's intended for the brain, if you want to put it that way. Who should be getting that? The brain. If you look at glucose utilization at rest, out of a 2,000 calorie diet, your obligate might only be 500 kilocalories of glucose that you've got to have at rest. Remember, at rest, fat's going to be your primary metabolism. And I think you get the idea. Remember that muscle glycogen, there's huge amounts of muscle glycogen compared to how do you refill this as it gets drained. If you're not eating, if you're fasting, the liver is able to, has a reverse hexokinase that will release glucose into the bloodstream. Remember, the muscle glycogen cannot do that. It cannot be released. It's another way. Lactate is useful because the only way that the muscle can share energy with the rest of the body is as lactate. But it can't do that, and so I've drawn a separate thing that the muscle glycogen is a straight run to the muscle. So muscle only supplies itself. It's a nasty selfish order. So we're going to look a little bit, I think I've already talked to you about resting maintenance of glucose is not a problem. Even if you completely blocked your liver stores, you have an hour to go find some sugar before you become stupid. And since our hepatic stores are not usually blocked, you can, and the muscle will supply itself, you can usually go 2 or 3 days before your blood glucose drops. So not a problem. During exercise, we have several factors that increase total flux. So factors trying to pull the blood glucose down all relate to you're using more glucose somewhere, usually in the muscle. And so when you start to upregulate those GLUT4 receptors in the surface of the muscle cell, the contraction of calcium stimulates the GLUT4 receptors to act independent of insulin. So you start to really always, when you start exercise, glucose transport out of the bloodstream and into the working muscle goes up. The more muscle you're working, the stronger the drawdown. The fight back to this is decrease insulin, because insulin puts glucose out of the bloodstream. So inhibit it. You want glucose in the bloodstream, and it's being pulled out by something else. Inhibit the glucose. Notice that by inhibiting the insulin, but increasing the GLUT4 receptors and having them work based on calcium, you actually increase glucose flow into the working muscle, but you shut down glucose flow into the skin. Your bones really don't need any glucose during the workout. You know what I mean? So you retard glucose flow into cells that are not critical, and you keep it going into the muscle. Make sense? And then all these other hormones, these are called counter-regulatory hormones, because these 5 counter the effect of insulin. All 5 of these go up during exercise. So there's a very strong, during exercise, drive to replenish the blood with glucose as quickly as it's being used up. So here's a typical This is graded exercise, so this is the workloads at higher and higher levels. Usually the way you make this graph, they do 30 minutes of exercise at that workload, you make your measurement. 30 minutes of exercise on another day at this workload, you make your measurement. And it's showing you, as I've said before, that insulin is inhibited. Why couldn't they put units on this? I will promise you, with the workouts you do, it's cut in half at least. And if you like to push it, it's probably down to 1/4 of normal resting insulin. So exercise, besides all the other wonderful things it does for diabetes, it actually gives your pancreas a rest. Your beta cells get, oh, finally, I don't have to overmake insulin. I'm going to take a nap while the rest of the body's exercising. And then here's the counter-regulatory hormones going high. I gave you another, cortisol gets parentheses, because cortisol is really a stress hormone. So if you're fighting Uriah Faber, yeah, your cortisol goes up because you're being pummeled to death. If you're doing your routine exercise, cortisol changes are really quite minor. And you do not get that gigantic consumption of muscle that all your other biochem profs have talked to you about. That's starvation, that's deadly disease. But the regular cortisol levels, when you take an exam, and you can, I will admit, you can measure cortisol go, it's so tiny, it's not hurting you. Elisa?
So if we did like really little exercise, we did we actually see?
Actually, well, it depends on how hard you go. Elisa, that's an awesome question. Awesome possum, awesome. If you take your old diabetic parents out for a walk, they will tend to actually, by the end of the exercise, have a lower blood glucose because they've opened up ports into their working muscle. You guys, it's going to depend on how hard you work. If it's anywhere in sort of the mild jog, walk kind of category, you'll tend to come out even. You'll have a very similar glucose. If you hammer it, the inhibition of insulin is so strong, and the breakdown of liver glycogen is so intense under the surge of epinephrine when you're doing like a maximal sprint, you'll actually see it rise. And so only the most intense exercise, once again, that's not that won't hurt you. You haven't created exercise-induced diabetes. It's a transient having to do, you flooded the bloodstream with glucose.
So our blood glucose during exercise would depend on the rate of it being released into the bloodstream and also the versus the rate being absorbed.
Perfectly said. Everyone heard that? So it would be the blood glucose during a work bout would be a related rates problem of how quickly is it being added and how quickly is it being removed. And in most cases of exercise, it won't budge. It'll be pretty stable. Oh, I may show you a graph in the next few minutes of that. So I threw this in again just to show you the difference of a single 1 hour bout, showing you the changes in some of these things. And then this is, here's for instance showing you cortisol levels if you really are hammering versus if you actually are doing light work, your cortisol levels go down. So I put all these up. Notice if you wanted to make a generalization, all of the hormones related to glucose control follow a curvilinear pattern with increasing work. So all of them do some version of this, except insulin, which drops. So insulin is the outlier in the hormone response. You want to inhibit insulin, and then all the other ones help you in recruitment. For those of you who have not had your endocrinology recently, I just threw this up here. Here are all the counter-regulatory hormones and insulin, and just to help you remember what they do. I'm not going to grill you on that. That's just for your future endeavors. So, wow, I'd be delighted. Am I going too fast? Am I killing you? I'm not trying to kill you. It'd be very nice if we could finish this lecture. So now at 20 minutes of exercise, just to show you how different this is. The blood glucose, Elisa, I've done it. Here, the blood glucose is still stable at the same level it was 20 minutes into 7 minutes of exercise. That's my warm-up. And notice that the liver glycogen breakdown has doubled. So you're dropping, so if this is the same and you're dropping twice as much glucose into it, what does that tell you about utilization? It had to go up, right? And so again, utilization has gone up, and I forget what the value was here before. I think it was something like 400 kilocalories per day, and now it's almost 400 kilocalories per hour. So it's about 20-fold increased rate in glucose. That's about right. The majority of that, oh yeah, here it is, 15 grams per day was going to the muscle at rest, because resting muscle needs hardly anything. Now it's 15 grams per hour, so about a 20-fold increase. And remember, the other big element that is helping the exercise happen is the muscle glycogen window inside the cell has opened. And so you're getting far more energy actually from within the muscle than you are. But this is a huge suck now. I don't know what this was before. 15 grams per day. It's now 80 grams per hour. So a huge amount of, if you're working hard, glucose is disappearing into the muscle. Okay. And you can read this on your own. It just told me that it tells you that you start to become much more glucose dependent. You now, if you were somehow turn off the hepatic drop into the bloodstream, instead of having an hour to find sugar, you'd have 3 minutes. By the way, that doesn't ever happen. You can make that happen with drugs, but it's hard to do. Okay, so why is there such a gigantic, this is going to be review and then we'll get to the end. Why is there so much pull into the muscle? The first one is the upregulation of the GLUT4 receptors. The second is the draining down of the glucose into glycolysis, so you're actually creating a gradient for glucose within the cell. Remember, there's going to be more blood flow across the surface of the muscles, so more glucose is now available in terms of presentation than at rest. Yeah, it's all said right there. This is fun because Dr. Bodine, this is the actual GLUT4 measurements. So here's resting. Notice that if you go just 5 minutes of exercise, you might add 50% to your GLUT4 receptors, and your glucose transport increases by the same amount. Notice, as I'm saying, by the time you get beyond a half an hour, you've adapted the surface of your muscle cell to double glucose, blood glucose transport, primarily from the GLUT4 receptors and their calcium facilitation. So during exercise, your muscle becomes a giant glucose sucking machine to the extent that you have a nice glycogen supply already inside. Well, your blood glucose will not be heavily dinged. You'll stay, as Elise's question, it'll stay in balance as long as you have glycogen. Well, I just put my finger on where I'm trying to get to for the end of the lecture. What happens if you've been doing this for 90 minutes and you now are running out of muscle glycogen? What will happen? So, the lecture will end without rush. Everyone okay? All right. So, here we are after 90 minutes of that same exercise. 20 minutes we look pretty fast. Plenty of hepatic glucose for the brain. We had plenty of muscle glycogen, right? And the problem is the person didn't stop working. So, I've made this pale, I hope. See, this is pale. Notice that we now have a drop. So, Elisa, here's the answer to your question. In this situation, the blood glucose has actually dropped from 80 to below 70. It's starting to fall. And let's see if we can figure out why. We are putting in 34 grams per hour because we've used half of the liver's half empty. And so the process starts to slow down in terms of breaking down glycogen. You start to get to more branch points, more debranching enzymes being used, less liberation, less surface area. It all slows down. And so you're adding 34 grams, but you're removing 42. Well, you guys can figure that out, right? So it's going to start dropping. Well, where is it going? You're still using, if you're doing the work, you're still using 80 grams an hour. And what's happened is this was, that was at rest, 2 kilocalories an hour. It's jumped up to this, and what's happening is now that that's draining out, you can't hit. This probably used to be, I'd have to go back and look at the last figure, but at any rate, you're running out of internal cellular glucose, and so you pull more and more from the bloodstream. Okay. So the reason I push so hard is we've actually got somewhere in terms of, many of you want to talk about fatigue, what causes fatigue. The great problem with fatigue is there's multiple different causes. What stops you from doing the second rep in a 1 rep max, totally different limiter than what stops a marathoner when they hit the wall at 20 miles. But here is one fatigue arising, which is metabolite depletion. The muscles will not run as fast, nor will the brain remember why we're doing this if you start to run out of glucose. So here's a great example of that. Let's look over, okay, it looks like we're going to look here first. So this is a scan where they've given a labeled glucose. They took one of the carbons off and put in isotopic fluorine, so you can actually, it doesn't actually get oxidized, the enzymes don't recognize it, but it does pass the GLUT4 receptors and get taken up. And so you can see at rest, where is most of the glucose going? Hardly any to the muscle, lots of it to the guts, the heart always gets some, and your brain is your prime consumer. Oh, wonderful. During exercise, the brain still gets what it needs. The heart, if anything, gets more. You turn off your guts, you turn off your skin. So where's the big port that opened up? This is after a half an hour of running around the hospital and being rescanned. Make sense? So if you keep this situation on long enough, you get to this point where, look, this is 2 hours is right here. So after 90 minutes, blood glucose, oh, Lisa, what a great. So notice how long the blood glucose was stable, but then you pushed it into glycogen depletion of the muscle. If you're going to keep doing the work, the muscle's going to look for glucose. And so it starts draining the bloodstream. I promise you, by the time you're below 50, most people are dead stupid. I actually have to get off my bike because I can't remember how to work the shifters or where I'm going. I get off the bike and I sort of lay by the side of the road and wait for one of my buddies to come back and explain to me what's happening, put sugar in my mouth. Does that make sense? So very interesting phenomenon. This, of course, the whole basis of why we would carbo load before an endurance event comes up. The whole logic of why would you take goo. Notice you now have enough to understand about why taking goo before the event is not a good idea. Taking it after 40 minutes, when you've opened up the pipeline that sends it to the right place, that's when supplemental glucose is used. Thank you for letting me go a little fast, but we're all caught up.